Capital Record, where we defend free enterprise and capital markets because we believe in the dignity of the human person. Hello and welcome to David Bahnsen's Capital Record, brought to you by National Review, where now for the second week in a row, we're doing something very special that we did a grand total of 2 times all of last year and have already done now twice here in the early parts of 2026. And that is bring a special guest on, much like the old days of Capital Record. And I will spare you the same joke I made last week about how happy you must be to hear less of me today, and hopefully how excited you will be to hear from our guests. But I am particularly excited for the guest we have and for the conversation we're about to have around the topic that we're about to get into. That topic is artificial intelligence and the general approach to AI that I believe so many on the right are getting wrong. And so that is what we're going to talk about. And to do that, I'm going to bring in Tim Estes, who is going to introduce himself, tell you a bit about his background and why I believe he has some of the most profound ideas and basically things to share on this topic. It doesn't mean you'll agree with all of the conclusions, but it should be provocative enough for you to think through where we are in this pivotal and transformative moment, not only in this technology, but with how we think about it, both from a political, economic, and a general public policy framework. And I would add to that culturally as well, that the way in which our culture interacts with technology is a big part of our economic worldview and not something that I think we are necessarily thinking through the right way all the time. So with that said, Tim, welcome to Capital Record.
David, thanks for having me.
Tim, why don't we start off by telling our listeners why you are the guest to talk about this subject, what your background is, and what sort of got you animated around this particular subject.
Yeah, well, I am a 25-year, well, actually 26-year now, another one in 2026, AI entrepreneur. I have been building AI companies since I was 20 years old. I have built out a company that worked deeply in the post 9/11 world, looking for bad guys using AI that was very advanced at the time, and even today is advanced by some standards. And that technology was used for about a decade, trying to help our servicemen overseas to protect them, to find bad guys. And then it got picked up post-financial crisis by Wall Street to read emails and chats and other types of unstructured data. To be able to find people that were abusing their positions, abusing their customers, colluding, and basically proactively police those people working with compliance departments. Along the way, we had a couple of other interesting applications that we built with major players. I had a lot of investors raise about $120 million from a diverse set of strategic investors, and one of them was HCA. We built out early applications to identify cancer patients with HCA in the 2010s using AI. By reading doctor's notes. So a very early version of the ChatGPT type technologies that have emerged. Then the project I'm kind of most proud of in that whole 20-year tenure was one where we built a system called Spotlight in partnership with a wonderful charity called Thorn that Ashton Kutcher actually set up to target child sexual abuse online. That system was one that they came to us early in the 2010s to tell us that they had interviewed surviving children that were being sex trafficked, like in California and elsewhere. And those children were actually being advertised online as escorts. So 3/4 of the rescued children were actually advertised as escorts. And half of those children were being forced to write their own ad. So it would sound like a child and attract those kinds of buyers. And obviously with all the Epstein stuff in the news these days, like this hits home again because like this was industrialized. There was a company called Backpage that had hundreds of millions of ads, or 100 million plus ads at different times. And we crawled all of them in the old system. This is the 2010s, so it was a big undertaking. But that tool, Spotlight, started being used by law enforcement to the great legacy of the McCain family, who was a major sponsor of this. They decided to fund it and some others, and they said, give it away. And so we gave it away to law enforcement. It was never a business area for us, and it led to 12,000 children being identified in this country who are being trafficked for sex online over the course of about 7-8 years. And so that was really the issue that got me into the intersection of child harms and child abuse and technology. And that kind of is all I've been focused on for the last 3 or 4 years.
Well, I think that a lot of people are probably wondering right now, and I know the answer to some degree, but I'd love to hear you explain. So many folks think artificial intelligence started in November of 2022 when ChatGPT was available as an app on our iPhones. And that generative AI and the language models that we now have associated with brand names, whether it be Gemini or Claude or what have you, that was sort of the beginning of AI. But you talked about doing this for 25, 26 years and some of the applications and success you had with it in the 2010s. Just at basic level as possible with technological speak, what do you mean by that AI versus what we now think of as AI?
Yeah, and so you can think of it as, something that's 4 or 5 generations where different advances were made in each generation. So when I started, it was actually really challenging to have a computer process a few documents and figure out who the people were and the places were. And in a post 9/11 world, that was very important. Like, who is the person? Where were they? When were they there? What did they do? And a lot of the 2000s to the 2010 was getting that to be accurate enough to automate. And so that was what was called early natural language processing. And there were approaches that were all rule-based using giant dictionaries. And there were approaches like we were doing that were statistical. We actually trained models. But at the time, the compute we had was probably a millionth the compute that ChatGPT is running on today. So we were dealing with algorithms that had to be much more efficient and much more limited. So that type of technology, one of the problems was you had to teach it specific examples, like label the data in specific examples and actually have the algorithm know how to basically chop up the data just the right way to learn from it. This is called feature extraction. And in the 2010s, there was a bit of a breakthrough that had been churning through the early 2000s in the research field by about 4 people. And that breakthrough created this process called deep learning. And that was a reinvention of an earlier technology, neural networks, that could actually solve that feature extraction problem, i.e. you could feed almost raw data to the system and it would figure out the order in the data. And that'll let it build up these building blocks. Okay, like for instance, giving enough like pictures of cats and dogs that it figures out some level of catness versus dogness. Okay, so it was actually the ability to understand that, which is something the human brain does really good as babies, like out of the gate. That AI or technology and computers were never very good at, that we became very good at in the 2010s. And so that led to a revolution over about a decade in pattern recognition. And you notice this by having things that could detect and classify images. Okay, in the mid 2010s, computers started to be able to take a picture and it could label it. Then it became where you actually could use Siri and it wasn't garbage, or you actually could understand what you were saying. And that's when it went into voice. Now, what happened with ChatGPT is the same building blocks that led it to understand those kind of patterns started to move from the recognition of a high level pattern, like labeling something, to understanding the semantics of longer context, and therefore understanding like language at the paragraph and the document level. And once that happened, the generative AI breakthrough, essentially what started with the transformer architecture from Google in 2017 and then moved into other variations like the GPT architecture that became ChatGPT, those different architectures kind of took those advances and created a fascinating move where it could actually create a response to predict the next token. And predicting the next token, given all the background probability, ended up creating actual sentences that made sense for the first time, and then actual paragraphs, and now entire giant reasoning chains. So that's and I'm trying to best do this at, I think, hopefully the right level for this audience, but that's the buildup. And I think I've walked through maybe 4 different steps or 5 different steps since 2000 when I had started, and a lot of the consequences of that. So today we have systems that are immensely sophisticated at understanding the long-range probabilities of certain context. And there is a credible argument that at least part of human intelligence is that. I would not say all of it is by any means, but there is something being emulated now, which is why it's creating kind of all of this value and potential that wasn't possible, even 5 years ago, in some ways even 3 years ago.
So, in terms of that technological progress and the catalysts that were behind it that you've kind of laid out, which I think is fascinating. At the same time that a lot of these things were evolving, we also those were sort of behind the scenes preparatory, building developments that weren't ready yet for prime time. But at the same time, we were in a technological era that was playing out in real time in the public square with social media.
Yeah.
Are these largely the same players that were building generative AI capability that has now led to the kind of, impressive and transformative results that we've seen in the last couple of years? Were these some of the same companies that were behind the social media revolution?
There is overlap for sure. So what I'd look at is the primary overlap and the major innovator was a company called DeepMind that Google acquired.
Okay.
And so the key architectural breakthrough transformers, as it was called, a new kind of learning model, came from DeepMind, and therefore came from Google. Meta and others were using
Tim,
some of these
did Google acquire 100% of DeepMind?
Yes,
Yeah.
they did. And I think they paid like half cash, half stock, and I think the stock side ended up being worth 10x what the cash was, but it's still
Yeah.
probably one of the steals of the century. And so long story short is Google, what I'd say is search and social and the innovation in search and social were major capital catalysts for the innovations in AI. And the goals in social initially were about recommendation and about essentially modeling and profiling the human user to keep them addicted to the screen. I'm just going to kind of cut to the chase and
Yeah.
think at this point we have overwhelming data that the kinds of usage we're seeing of social media is completely misaligned to human value and utility. And because of that, like it doesn't make sense rationally that it happens unless it's actually overcoming human rationality. And so what we saw in Silicon Valley for the last 20 years was this remarkable departure from the technologies I grew up with, the Steve Jobs and Bill Gates types of, tech titans that built tools that billions of people ended up using that made their lives better and different. What happened was that was when technology companies built products for human beings. And then what happened with essentially Google initially with its advertising model, and then Meta, kind of coming along and really taking it to the next level, and then finally TikTok and the Chinese taking it to the next level, it was about turning the humans into the product. And so they decided they could make as much or more money than serving humans by turning humans into a product. And to do that, they've used a set of technologies and techniques that overwhelm the human capabilities, for instance, to decide to stop. And this is actually on trial here in California right now, right, on the social media cases and how this has impacted children. So right now,
you're referencing
yes.
the addictive nature.
Yes. And so it's 2 points. Number one is technology. I call this process the Great Inversion. Technology for all of human history was about increasing productivity of human beings and capacity of human beings. Like that's the covenant. That's why we care about technology. It makes us more of us. Okay. Technology that's come up since the early 2000s looks a lot more like the narcotics industry. It's essentially a way for people to escape their reality so that they are able or overwhelm their own ability to govern themselves and their time because it knows how to create this kind of intermittent rewards, much like a slot machine, and use that to overpower people. So there's been all kinds of technologies that have used addictive principles in design, gambling, systems being one of those. And what we're dealing with now essentially is a regime where we highly underregulated the online world, allowing this to proliferate, even as we, kind of underinvested in the real world.
So at the time that was playing out in the social realm, and you mentioned search as well, but that people as product component is far more prevalent in social
Correct.
than
Yeah.
search. Were you critical of it then? Were you concerned about it? Did you see where it was going? How were you analyzing it at the time?
Yeah, so I would say in the early 2010s when it started to pick up like real momentum, meaning, I mean, Facebook launched in 2004. It wasn't something that general people could use, I think, until like '07 or '08 or '09. It started to proliferate. So they were in an organic expansion mode of just connecting people for the first 6 to 10 years of that company, right? So they had natural growth metrics. They didn't have to make it more addictive. The problem is once they started saturating all the people being connected, how do you keep growing at that rate? Well, you have to get people to spend more time. And to spend more time isn't natural unless you go and overwhelm essentially their own resolve and governance of themselves, which is very much like what a narcotic does. So what you see is all these companies making enormous investments in a combination of algorithmic engineers and brain science and other things in order to be able to figure out how to keep people on the system, keep them hooked. And I think that was going on during that window of time. So what did I do? I didn't know about that. Most of us didn't know about that until the last few years with some of the whistleblowers and the public releases. What I did know back in the 2010s is I felt like they were totally untrustworthy in terms of privacy. So I felt like they were basically taking data, appropriating data, giving it to third parties without really being clear about that. So I was actually on record being pretty critical of social media in the 2010s on the privacy issues. Given I was working a lot in the government space, the intelligence defense space, I'd get all kinds of questions of, did you worry about, the government collecting this for security reasons? And I would say, the truth is that there's actual laws so that if you abuse this, like for instance, FISA, like if you abuse that stuff, you're supposed to at least lose your career and probably go to jail. Now, unfortunately, we've seen that didn't happen in some cases. So that's a whole nother subject. So I don't want to, like my naivety, I feel a little naive in retrospect. I didn't think political leaders would weaponize it and the professionals would let them. I think we have a clear track record that did happen. Having said that, I think that the companies have been unaccountable the whole way, pretty much on this.
So Tim, I wrote a book, my first book I ever wrote, called Crisis of Responsibility, where I was intending to try to provide a lot of specificity about the actors in the financial crisis of 2008 and go make some different cultural, economic, ethical conclusions from it. But one of the things I did in that book was, in my, I think, second chapter, is criticized when we will go say, we're mad at big pharma or Wall Street or big government. And they're not critical because I think those sectors or spaces should ever be off limits, but because what happens is they end up lacking specificity and allowing a little bit of scapegoating that gives people the freedom to not have to define what the bad action is. So when we talk about big tech, one of the things you're doing right now is fascinating to me, is you're defining some of the bad actors or actions, and yet it doesn't apply to big tech, right? You're talking to specific social media actors with specific strategies. Whistleblowers have shown a light on it. When you talk about the people becoming the product, and I'm going somewhere to AI with this in a moment, but Amazon didn't need to do that to generate e-com. Google didn't need to do that with search. I don't want to be critical of big tech the way that certain people are, because it's almost like a class warfare argument. With this particular criticism, are you applying it to all of Silicon Valley, or are you applying it really particularly to social media? I want to kind of fine tune where this applies. Does it apply to search? Does it apply to e-commerce? Does it apply to software?
I think it can apply in all the places where, so there's a term in this area called dark patterns. Okay. And in the technology world, when you design a user experience, you can make choices that make a user do what you want them to do, but not something in their best interest. And it's called a dark pattern. I believe that all the companies that are employing dark patterns and monetizing human beings because of those dark patterns are an example of the bad guys. So I think that it comes down to this. I'll get more philosophical because I know we're here on a show that cares about actual philosophy and cares about actual grounding. I believe that technology tended to, I'm going a little bit wide here, but the Silicon Valley that I grew up with, the romanticized one, the fire in the valley kind of ones, that was the think different people. That was the give them this tool to be so much more. And I loved that. I fell in love with that. Like, I didn't go to California because I've always been conservative. I'm a Tennessee boy, came up as a person close to Fred Thompson was one of my heroes. And I'm a huge fan of our current senator, Senator Blackburn, who's one of the real leaders on this. I believe that that was truly an American view of technology to basically empower the individual, empower the user, and serve the user. And I think what happened is a set of people, and this is actually tied into a great book from the 90s, I'm sure you read, Thomas Sowell's Vision of the Anointed. And I believe that the anointed came into Silicon Valley.
Conflict divisions.
Yes. And so, yeah, and so I think that they came into Silicon Valley coming up from more like left-oriented utilitarian philosophy. And they said, you know what? If we make a bunch of money and control the future, it's not a big deal that we do it on the backs of all these people, that we treat people as numbers, that we influence them against their own best interest. And so I think there's an ethical breach that happened in the early 2000s and just compounded to now. And I do believe, going back to an earlier question you asked, I think that some people that are totally stooped in that ethical failure are driving AI today, but not all the companies driving AI today are stooped in that ethical failure. I'll give you an example you use. You mentioned Microsoft. I think Microsoft's making a lot of proactive, thoughtful decisions from data centers. They put out a very interesting policy that balances their corporate responsibility and their impacts with their need to build. And I expect the president tonight might actually take a standard like that out to the industry. So bottom line is, I think they're ones doing the responsible thing. Mustafa Suleyman, who runs Microsoft AI, is another good example. He's ex-DeepMind, by the way. So a lot of the people that are at DeepMind that created this, they are both very concerned about being misused, and they're being as responsible as they can be. And now none of them perfect. You know, there's probably individual things I won't agree with in that per se, but contrast that with the people that want no rules, the people that write $100 million checks to companies that create chatbots that have sexual conversations with children en masse. I mean, one of the companies that one of the biggest VCs, and I'm not going to go into name by name, people can figure it out, but one of the companies, one of the biggest VCs in the world, and one of the companies they funded, has probably had more sexually exploitative conversations with children than Jeffrey Epstein ever did. To understand the scale of the harms, the scale of the damage some of these companies are doing, and extremely limited accountability. And so that's kind of intersecting to today. Like, I've been focused for now the last really 5 years, 4 or 5 years since I wrapped up that last job, on how do we use AI to protect kids. So that's kind of my day job at Angel Q. But in the political world, in the policy world, I believe that no company can solve that problem, and that we're at a place that's very much like what Bill Buckley wrote so many years ago, when he said he would not cede more power to anyone, not to the state, not to General Motors, not to the CIO. So concentration of power and the abuse that comes from it is, to me, one of the most quintessential conservative principles to fight and stand forward against that. And so I think the conservative movement has to rise above the simplistic arguments going around deregulation to understand that we're in an out of balance, skewed economy right now on the technology area that's actually impacting kind of our moral society foundations.
Well, you mentioned Thomas Sowell and his concept of the constrained vision that he wrote about in what I believe is one of the greatest books ever written in human history, Conflict of Visions. And I would argue that one of the things that constrains power is markets and the competitive forces that exist and incentives that exist embedded in markets. And one of the things that distorts that constraint is when private actors get in bed with the government. And so the power that Bill would have been referring to about General Motors would have been very limited if all General Motors had was great company, great product, great technology, great reputation, great brand, but every single day fighting it out with competitors. But then when a company is able to use their market position to build a moat with the government, they have the real power, both from the guns and the taxes. Okay. So with AI, if I want to follow along with everything you said so far, and which I do, and in agreement, concern about unchecked technological development not being thought in terms of where it could damage children, where a business model is changed and it happened very quickly, and there's been various societal damage done, all these different things. I would argue that where I get really concerned is when the government starts making exceptions to make their lives easier. So I understand there's one school of thought that people can say government needs to go shut this down. No more AI. It's too scary. And I don't think you're saying that, and I'm most certainly not saying that. But then there's another school of thought that is what I believe a lot of the people you're critical of seem to now be supporting, and a lot of people who have the ear of the president, is this is such a big deal and such a big opportunity. We need the government to kind of do us a solid here. Let's get waivers for IP law. Let's get waivers for regulation. Let's get waivers for zoning requirements for our the construction of what will produce power for us. I can go on and on. Is your concern the unchecked power just merely in market actors that are all, in fairness, competing with each other, right? I mean, we're hearing more and more of language models that are gaining position against OpenAI or losing to them. But I guess if you were talking about kind of a big 4 or 5, we can review for people. But there's Claude, who is made by Anthropic. There's Grok, which is Elon Musk's and owned by the parent company to Twitter, XAI. There's OpenAI, which owns ChatGPT. What am I missing here? Gemini, which is Google's. I guess you'd probably argue Perplexity would be a smaller player.
Yeah, there's a few smaller players. I think you've covered like the 4 biggest ones out there. If I'm trying to think of anyone that really, like, Microsoft has their own offering they're working on, but it's still very early because they were closely partnered with OpenAI when this started. But you've laid out like many of the key ones. And I think that I think what we have to look at here is there are a set of sort of deep intellectual dissonance arguments going on at the same time, things that just don't quite add up. And I'll go through the common ones just real quick. And the reason I want to go through them is they all are in service of exactly what you just said, which is different rules for them. Okay. And so the first argument is, especially to conservatives, is, well, we're not for regulation. And if you're for regulation, you're for basically big government, you're socialist. And that's completely misaligned with the history of conservatism. It's completely misaligned with Ronald Reagan's tenure, in that it's always about smart regulation to keep the markets functioning normally and creating truthful transfer of information and reliable products.
But I think you missed one important element, though: consistent regulation that is applied equally under the law.
Correct. Exactly. That's right. And so I think that's, and so the idea that you could have, I mean, I guess they make the mistake that many conservatives has, I think, appropriately criticized over the years, which is the people advocating are treating markets as a means to unto itself instead of a means to an end. Markets are a means to the advance of civilization. They are not an end of civilization. And by confusing that and having manifest proof of harms to civilization from some of the applications and some of the business practices, is essentially to undermine our own civilization by doing nothing. And so I think that's a real root issue. Now, the second big issue that is meant to appeal to national security conscious people is the idea that China's not interfering with theirs, and if we interfere with ours, we're going to lose. And I find this to be, in some ways, the most detestable argument, because, first of all, China actually is doing things to protect their children with this technology. I mean, they have limits on social media, like 40 minutes a day. Going in, the TikTok of China has a hard shutoff at 40 minutes. If TikTok did that here in the US, the revenues are probably cut to like 1/4 of what they are. And some people would be out of luck.
Is that limit in China, is that age-based?
Yeah, it's for younger people. It's like, I think if it's like 16 and below, or if it's like 18 and below, but it's definitely younger people.
And other countries have done similar things. I believe Australia.
Yeah, it's getting broad. Australia, UK's looking at it. I mean, I even saw something very encouraging from Laura Trump that the president's considering something like this now. And so that was in the last, I think, 48 hours or so. So I say this because the idea that we can't protect our citizens because it'll keep us from advancing as fast as China, like, is something China's laughing at right now, because they know that not protecting your kids and allowing them to be exploited will undermine your whole population and their ability to be strong and fight a war in the future if you had to. And so I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, somehow we try to reconcile this idea that we're supposed to be competing against China by not restricting our industries, and yet letting us sell some of our best chips to China and letting our allies send the technology to make those chips to mainland China. And we get 25% of the revenue cut, so it's all good. And that to me is preposterous. So you either have to be consistent and actually be in the war on this thing and treat it much like Ronald Reagan did with the COCOM and the very famous Toshiba incident, from the 80s, right? And where they were selling, to the Soviets some key technology, and he put them under sanctions for years. So I think that I do believe that there is a very big difference between dime store libertarian, weak philosophy. And I mean that by not people that have done the work, haven't actually dug into the balance that has to be there to protect human dignity, which is the foundation of all freedom. If you sacrifice human dignity to get a laissez-faire, anything goes kind of freedom, you will not have a society. And every person who created these philosophies that have built the foundations for us have said this. And now we have this weird, almost like the AI summary version of it they're using for ads. And instead, and so I don't want our audience here, I don't want the people listening to this that are principled conservatives to actually fall for this anymore. They need to realize that what's going on is there's a set of companies that are making enormous bets and capital expenditures and infrastructure. And what they're scared of is that bet actually ties into a laissez-faire model because they haven't been regulated for 25 years, even though they're harming people along the way. They're harming people right now. They're harming copyright holders en masse. I mean, that's the other thing that's so ironic about the China card. The greatest counterfeiters in the world used to be China until the AI models came along. And now we have the greatest counterfeiters in the world coming from American AI companies, acting like Chinese companies with no sanctions.
So Tim, you and I have talked offline about this a little bit, and these are the subjects that I most care about here: the protecting of human dignity being the end, the markets being a means to the types of lives, a good life that we want human people made in the image of God to enjoy. I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second because I think it's important. I am a big believer in what you're saying, that no conservative believes in anarchy. And yet I also believe in limiting principles. And so when we talk about regulation, smart regulation, it's principle driven. I'm uncomfortable with the notion of regulation that we say, well, this is in theory, the rhetoric of we're regulating for the purpose of enhancing human dignity. That doesn't have a limiting principle to it. I want to know where you might disagree with me on this. What you're talking about with the IP theft, the China was the biggest ripoffs, and until AI came along, now AI is worse. Do we not already have regulation against intellectual property theft? Wasn't that illegal before November of 2022? In other words, are you actually asking for new regulation? And maybe you are, but in this point you're making, isn't it just a matter of enforcing the regulatory apparatus that we already have, the same IP structures that we use to protect our pharmaceutical industry, our inventions, the various R&D that drives a lot of our dynamic market existence?
Well, so I think that what I'm looking at is twofold. One is I agree that the biggest thing is to enforce the laws we have, but these companies want to start getting exemptions for these laws when it comes to AI training. So they want different new rules that essentially go against, hundreds of years of law and common law around these things in order to enable them to go faster and not fix the problem. Okay. So I'm against them getting carve-outs on this because they basically have flouted the law, and there have pending court cases around this, and there's tons of them. So I expect that may play itself out, but what they want desperately
that's a conservative view. That's a conservative view.
Yes,
no exceptions.
Yes. That's right. So that's my primary, and my secondary is not so much needing, new laws to protect, authors and creators and other things, as much as now it's at such an easy mass scale that we need some laws for protecting individual image and likeness. So there's a new problem that technology has enabled, which is the copying and the stealing, essentially, of people's individual likeness. This is sort of the deep fake on steroids kind of problem that's now quite possible, right? We're watching like the sea dance model come out of China that can create these amazing videos with like Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise fighting when they've never actually been in the scene like that to fight before. It's surreal to watch how powerful this is. That same
Are a lot of
technology.
people looking? Are a lot of people looking for two 65-year-old men to fight? Is there?
Yeah, well, I mean, they must have, they must know how to keep themselves together,
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
I hope I'm in the remote zone of anything like that. I probably never will be, but like Tom Cruise and Maverick, I
that's
had to take
right.
my wife to, I had to take my wife to that, and what can I say? Like, that's a hard thing to live up to. So,
I hear you.
but in all honesty here, I think there's a new level of problem, which is the ability for people who take the likenesses. It could be of children. Like this is a big problem with
Yeah,
especially Grok in the past, few months. And I say this with a little bit of like, charity and empathy, because I think, Elon's been more aligned on some of these things than other things. But in this area, like they need to take the honest, view that that was a huge mistake. They should never
yeah.
have allowed like images of schoolgirls to be uploaded and essentially nudified. Like that was evil. That was wrong. And it was completely preventable. And
But
so, yeah,
I think you have to make a distinction, Tim, between new applications of
yes, yeah.
old laws.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think that bottom line is, I think that we have laws that are incomplete now with the technology advances. And I think we need to resist any changes of the laws that are really carve outs so people can do the wrong thing and get away with it. And I think that would be my view on the IP side. And I think we don't necessarily need a bunch of new sanctions on it. But I think that should be allowed to play out. And I do think that, frankly, we should be much more amenable to injunctive relief in some cases,
Yeah.
because what's going on is the harms are continuing to grow the longer these models run. And like I said, the technology is there to not train on these things. Like one of the things that most people don't know is the sort of deep contamination of these models with some kinds of data. There's actually a fairly famous suit going on between the porn industry and Meta, because Meta ripped down tons and tons of BitTorrents with very hardcore, disgusting levels of pornography, really, really out there stuff that I won't say. And they trained their llama models, the first big open source, using that data. And the porn people who built it are suing them for copyright violation. Now, who do you pick in that fight, right? But having said that, like that model was actually, for those that let their kids on Roblox, that model was the model Roblox was using for chatting with children. And you wonder why these things go off the rails. They've been trained on the most evil things imaginable. Well, guess what? It's not super hard. I'm a 25-year veteran who can say this with authority. It was not hard to prevent that kind of data from being detected and trained on. It was a decision that they wanted more at all costs because they thought it would create a better competitive outcome. And they polluted it with all this stuff. And we should be telling them, no, you can't put that kind of model in front of children.
This is the thing. I'm guessing I speak for our listeners right now. I find what you're saying to be so basic and obvious and common sense, but I don't know what you know about the technological capability. Can you say that companies cannot allow the deep fakes, the things that are essentially fraudulent, right? That would represent in an old world, false advertising and misrepresentation and so forth. Can that be done with AI, or is the generative nature of it, is that impossible without just shutting down AI?
Yeah, no, I think it absolutely can be done. So I think, for instance, if you have marked copyrighted items, don't train on it. And if it generates it from something that hasn't been trained on, then you that would be an interesting kind of gray area to litigate and deal with, which they may prevail on that, and maybe that's where the court should work out the gray area. I think that's completely in line with our system.
But make the
Yeah.
companies have a legal obligation to try.
Yeah, they have to try, and I think they have to own it when they violate it in a material way. So, for instance, if you want to risk creating sexual content from your model in terms of video and imagery, you better do some very aggressive things to avoid children coming out the other side. Or
Yeah.
you should be subject to, if not criminal penalties, which I think there's actually an argument for that, because I look at it this way. When a group of people use technical means to do something that if a human had done it, it would send them to jail for a decade or more, why should they not have that kind of penalty because they just use a different technical means to do it? See, so the idea that you actually reduce liability by using technology, I think is a terrible incentive in the market. So I think we need to look at rectifying it either with, at the least very severe, cost to it, but potentially pierce through that in some cases. And I mean this really for the more extreme, like really vicious use cases. Like the child sexual abuse material would be on that list with me. There won't be a ton of things on that list with me, but I think that that's one of them that should be obvious. And I think we've taken too much time. I mean, I briefed people on Capitol Hill for 3 years at this, I call it the CSAM apocalypse, the child sexual abuse material apocalypse, where it becomes so cheap to create high fidelity abuse material from any kid that's ever been in a yearbook. And there were steps we could have taken over the last couple of years with a Congress that we control, and now a White House that could eliminate this. Now, to the credit of the First Lady, who I really want to call out, like she got out there and led on the Take It Down Act, which was one part of this equation, and Senator Ted Cruz led on that as well. We need more of it. It's incomplete. The job is far from done. The harms are going on. And I think that this is something I really hope we hear something about in the State of the Union, that the supposed 4 C's of AI, one of which is protecting children, that this administration will be second to none in using the power to protect the vulnerable. And I believe protecting the vulnerable, I mean, another example, I mentioned that these companies, a lot of them over the last 20 years, have essentially embraced what I call a digital narcotics model. Like they do not make money by creating value. They make money by basically addicting you and then selling you. I believe we can actually look at, William Buckley's views on drug legalization here as an interesting example. He wasn't necessarily in the mainstream. I may not still be in the mainstream on that particular view, but he had a very thoughtful view about why he held the view. And he viewed it as something that needed to be regulated, like legal, but regulated and definitely not given to minors. That's his exact language from 1994 in his National Review article on the subject, or 96. And I think if even Buckley, who I don't think anyone could assail from a standpoint of conservatism and libertarianism, says that children, we as moral creatures have to have a set of special laws and protections for anyone that have specific developmental weaknesses or limitations, that abuse actually rises, almost like a national security issue, rises to the threshold of needing to require defense. I believe that's something that we've lost because I just sadly think it's because people that sit on the board of Meta are writing massive checks to certain candidates. And then they're getting these dime store arguments that I think I've debunked now. So I believe we have to transcend this. And I think that the president, we have seen the polling, 90% of Trump voters agree with what I'm saying. That's why it seems so obvious to you, David. 90% of Harris voters agree with what I'm saying. The worst thing we could do is put this administration and this Congress on the 10% side of a 90-10 issue and just hope no one notices.
Well, he's becoming more and more fond of 80-20 or 90-10 issues, the tariffs, the Epstein files. There's I don't know.
You take though. I hear you.
Well, that's right.
Yeah,
And this one's bigger. This one's bigger.
Yeah.
But let me ask you a question. You mentioned Meta. It's clear you have opinions on that particular organization, and I completely understand. But this goes, the people that have the ear of the president here, Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, Sam Altman himself at OpenAI, Jeffrey Sachs, this is now a formal position that he is the White House.
Yeah, David Sachs, the White House czar. Yeah, on AI.
On both crypto and AI. And I'll avoid getting into what I've seen in the crypto space from the new administration over the last year. But with the AI side, if we want to give a more charitable interpretation than the president just listening to donors, what are the I don't imagine that some of these folks I just said could go into the president and say, hey, let us do this, this, and this, and we'll write a big check to the inauguration or the future presidential library. What are the arguments they're making that he is listening to that is resulting in him saying things like we need to bypass normal state jurisdiction on certain things? How are they getting through to him, and how would you push back on the arguments they're making?
Yeah, so I think ultimately, I have a very charitable view of this president and the vice president, because honestly, they're fighters and they've accomplished a ton for the conservative movement. And there may be various things along the way that I don't quite understand, and maybe some of us don't understand. or maybe even don't fully agree with. But the bottom line is, this is kind of beyond the 11th commandment, right? Like you don't want to have friendly fire here, and we're all in this struggle together, I think. Well, okay, when you get to this kind of situation and you try to be charitable about it, I think that when, what is it, like 40% of the S&P is 10 companies that are tech company, American companies. I think ultimately our president wants some of our strongest companies to stay the strongest companies in the world. So I think he's like at core a pro-American capitalist, maybe probably more so than almost any president ever has been. Okay. And I think that they're telling him that, if they do this or the other, they will be less so. And I think the hard part is when you say, you know what, I don't quite buy that. You can make these changes in your business. And I mean, I'll give you an example. X doesn't need to put out like these romantic chatbots that can talk to children. Like they just don't. Elon should be given every single ability to go build 1 million or 100 million Optimus robots so we can actually have manufacturing move from China back here, okay? Because robotics is the secret to us moving from low labor overseas back to insourcing it at home without costing us jobs and actually gaining us jobs. And that's a brilliant use of AI. So I think a thoughtful, strategy here would be put this amazing world-changing technology to the best use and create the incentives to do that. And then the ones that are using it to basically make our children dumber, more addicted, harmed, that are using it to, enable our grandparents to have phone calls that are actually fake and getting fooled into things. I mean, all that stuff should be liability and sanctioned. And so what I'm trying to say is I believe ultimately the American people are going to be impacted dramatically by this change. And if you don't believe that, it means they're lying about the size of the change. So they're all saying this is the biggest thing to ever happen and it's going to have all these effects. If that's the truth, well, that means that there's going to be a set of effects. And a lot of those effects could be harms and a lot could be really big, economic creators or cures to disease. I don't think you have to accept exploitive, abusive applications of the technology to get the cancer saving technology. I don't believe that. I think it's a false choice. So I think we're trafficking in a false dichotomy. And I believe that America is big enough that we can ask our companies to do better and set up incentives to help them be better and not have the government tell them exactly what to do along the way. Okay. But set up incentives. I think that's the line. And if we do that, we're going to have a rebalancing and a better outcome on these things. And by that, we'll also end up with a way that I believe that, we can continue to have credibility with the American public that when these harms come, we did some things that mitigated them. Whereas if we do nothing and the harms come, they're going to run into the arms of the socialist. They're going to run into the people that will defend them. And we're going to have a new deal that starts from the current governmental debt level and current governmental socialism level and move it to a whole nother level. Mandami meets UBI is going to be the future of this country if we get this wrong, because we refuse to engage in the moral problem. And I think that that's a hard thing, because guess what? There'll be some bumps for these companies because they built their house on sand in some places. Now, Jensen Huang didn't. Everyone's going to want his chips. It's just going to keep going on. Maybe it's, a little bit excitable or a little bit overvalued, and maybe some of these CapEx expenditures are just overdone. So that'll require some recalibration. But the bottom line is, if you build an economy on giant leverage like that, you're asking for a reckoning at some point. We've already seen that. I mean, you know this far better than I do. I mean, you're deep into this. And I think that I think this president, needs to avoid the real prospect of a 2007, 2008 type correction that happens when all this comes home to roost, because the chips, start falling. And I don't think you can stop it by just letting them keep running. I think you've got to turn the ship a little bit. And, there's going to be massive disruption of jobs. I think the strategic posture is, let's get the jobs to come here from overseas, not our allies. We should be working with our allies to actually help them make this transition with us. But our adversaries, insofar as we're subsidizing them, and there's really only one that's gigantic on that, which is China, I don't really care what their unemployment rate is, especially if it drives a change in that government. I think that would be a brilliant thing for our world. And I think we should be using that opening to bring the jobs back here, focus on creation, focus on robotics, focus on things that rebuild the American manufacturing base while we have this immense technology window. And we should be doing a lot of things for health and wellness, and for the ability of young people and old to have more agency and look at technology more as a tool. And I think that requires a set of different incentives. I actually want to step away from regulation because I think regulation does take us down I think the issue is incentives and consequences. So I think there's a way to embed a kind of duty of loyalty into AI.
So let
Yeah.
me let
So
me
yeah,
pause you there because I want to conclude with you explaining that concept. I find
yeah.
it fascinating. I think it is provocative. I also think it is judicious, and so I wanted you to be able to lay it out for us. But just for the sake of where I think I'm
Mhm.
trying to play the role of mind reader of some of our listeners right now, that some listening to all this may be, I want to ask you a question, and I'm going to beg you to just play along with a hypothetical because it's hard to do because almost everything in the hypothetical is untrue. If, hypothetically, we had a situation where we had fully addressed child exploitation, abuse of children, harm to children, if, hypothetically, we'd fully addressed IP theft, we addressed deep fakes. We addressed all of these malignant issues that you have been talking about. If just you pretend they're dealt with one way or the other, they're not on
Mhm.
the table. And then now we're left with this sort of isolated AI capability that we've addressed all these other bad things, but lo and behold, it is going to create certain tools that make other software obsolete.
Mhm.
It's going to create certain tools that's going to damage certain content creators.
Mhm.
Um, would you still feel that certain activities are needed in a protectionist context without any of the other things on the table, um, isolated to just that economic impact? Or would you be more embracing of the creative destruction?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very hard one because my instinct is to kind of lean in the Schumpeterian kind of destruction, and just realize that on a 10-year horizon, that probably is the right strategy. The challenge is we haven't had it happen on a 2-year horizon before like this. So there's a bit of unknown here, and we just need to be honest that we're wrestling with that. So I think we have to anchor in the idea that the labor impacts, the productive impacts, essentially we need to be very, very thoughtful about intervening in those areas. But we cannot make it a suicide pact. Okay. We have to be thoughtful that the transition is something that actually can be consumed. If we have 30% of white collar jobs essentially nuked by AI over the next 3 years, like think about the dramatic economic consequences of that to people making 100, 150, 200K. And the fact that the only alternative they may have may be a job that's one third that value. And there may not be enough of those. And so that's become systemic. So there's a systemic risk issue I think we don't fully understand yet when that could be the velocity of it that we have to like really consider. But I don't come here with a proposal on that one. I think we need to think about it. I think we need to probably even convene some people to really talk about that in earnest as soon as possible, because the other side has a proposal. It's called UBI. It's called socialism, and we need to figure out like what our real answer to that is before it's the only option that people hear, and they're all suffering and they pick it.
So, I want you to be able to explain the solution for the other problems that I hypothetically pretended were gone that aren't gone, and that I think represent the larger and hopefully less controversial component. Protectionist measures around creative destruction, or when
Hmm.
you posit it with what if we had 30% unemployment, that the problem there is that that assumption requires us to take actions that might be worse than if we didn't do anything and it turned out that it affected 7% or 9%.
100% right. Yeah, I mean, 100% right on that. That's why I said I think we need to have a plan, and we would need to watch very carefully what happens. So, for instance, I mean, you're living in this world, all the impacts and all these SaaS businesses and other industries that have been decimated the past couple of months, um, like that may or may not be
In
justified.
fairness, some of them
So,
have not been decimated. Their stock prices are down, but
yeah.
we don't know yet the impact. But go ahead.
Well, when I say decimated, I mean their stock prices. So the pricing
Right, right.
of the companies. So
Yeah.
that anticipates a substantial impact on their earnings, on their growth rates, all these other things. That may not prove to be true. Because it may be that humans are the ultimate buyers and they still trust certain entities. And as long as those entities keep delivering well, they may perform well. And this
Yeah.
may be overdone. Like, I'm completely open to that possibility. I think we have to be ready if it's not, if it is this change. So I think that my response is, I'm not here to advocate a position or a policy yet. I think we need to have one, and we need to have it and watch what happens and use sort of minimal effective dose of intervention based on that as it happens, instead of getting way ahead of it. So
Okay.
like, this is an area where I think that, we just don't know. We've never gone through it before. Someone may come up with a set of new occupations that become the biggest, growth employment area in human history in the next 18 months, and we never even heard of it. We just don't know, right? So I think that it's part of it. So let me transition to where you're going with the question. I believe there is a fundamental framework that's aligned to both the moral and the fiscal conservative and even the national security conservative policies that can be laid out this way, which is AI by default should be designed with a duty of loyalty to the user. And the duty of loyalty to the user is something that aligns with how it's being used today. It's being used for legal advice. It's being used for medical advice. It's being used for all kinds of things that are very deep and sensitive. And in most the professional capacities, there's a privilege there. Now, whether you want to have like a true legal privilege or not, I think is an interesting question. But I know there should be obligations, that if you take on that role, that trusted role, there should be certain obligations. You cannot use that trust to lure people into a false sense of security and then abuse that trust by like giving that information to advertisers. And that's, Anthropic had some tremendous Super Bowl commercials in this, if you saw some of them. But this was the point, is that when people got on ChatGPT, I don't think any of them thought about, when they talked about the problems they had with their mother-in-law or something, that could be sold to advertisers later. But now it's going to be. And I think that is deeply, deeply problematic. And so I just give it as an example. But ultimately, a lot of the risks in AI, and we talked a lot about what I call the imminent risks, the harms that are happening now. There's also, we saw like recently last week, this issue where Amazon, part of its cloud basically got taken down and deleted because they deployed a bunch of AI without enough constraints, and it destroyed their software base.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's other risks out there. There's been a community around this for some time, but they call them existential risk. They call them catastrophic risk. I like to call it unknown risk. It's like the idea that if something is this powerful and you let it run on its own and you don't take the appropriate precautions to the degree you can, then you're setting up a really potentially bad situation. It's like gain of function research. It's why we banned it, right? Until Fauci came in and unbanned it behind the back of the president. And so I believe that in a similar capacity, we need to be very thoughtful about creating market incentives where there is a duty of loyalty that essentially is a combination of truth in advertising and duty of care concerns, a fiduciary kind of duty that is on these AI providers. And if they choose to go a different direction, you don't ban them. You don't have the government stop them and shut them down. They just have to accept product liability. So I believe you create incentives where duty of loyalty gives you a level of safe harbor, limits your exposure, and maybe you insure around it easily.
Give some examples in the marketplace where we have something not identical. There's complexity and nuance.
Yep.
Similar concepts. Is this akin to the do no harm principle in the medical community?
Yeah, no, I think it is. I mean, so it's medical and legal, the notion of sort of privilege and representing the interest of your clients. And if you were essentially
a fiduciary duty that like myself am a fiduciary in the world of finance, trust officers. Applying some sort of standard that is respected in the marketplace and enforced by the law.
That's exactly right. And I think that we can let liability create different incentives so that people create better aligned AIs. And then they have to justify more of the cases that they don't want to do that. And I'm not saying you can't. Not saying the government says no, but it says, you know what? If you do that and people get hurt, you don't get special protections. If you try your best, and you could let Congress and FTC create some very high level, like I think you can do this with what they call a low touch kind of approach. But I think there are some fairly common sense things you can do in this. And I think that would be a great foundation. And I think it opens up, if I can conclude with something, it opens up, the president talks a lot, and even David Sachs talks a lot about why America has to win the AI race. And one thing that I'm deeply disappointed in so far, and I hope it changes, is we have been fighting the AI race with one giant hand tied behind our back, maybe both, which is America is not America and great because we out-commoditize the Chinese. We're great because we live by a creed that has brought a diverse set of people together under a common view of human dignity and freedom that people all around the world literally die trying to get here to live in it. And our AI should be designed with human dignity in mind and with those same freedoms and protections, like innately in it to the degree we can. And we should be incentivizing that. We don't have to micromanage the companies and tell them how to do it, but we can sure as heck incentivize them to go that direction and then make it less interesting for them to go the other way. And if we end up having AI you can trust that preserves human freedom emerge from our providers in the US, China can't compete with that because their own AI models will never agree to that because it'll tell their own people to stand up against this totalitarian government. So let's compete in a way they cannot compete back with us, and let's make our investment there. And I think if we took that posture together with a structure that gave companies a way to be preserved and maybe some level of sandbox or some level of safe harbor if they go at this aggressively. I mean, think about what I just said and embedding it into every Optimus robot. Well, then you might be able to feel you could have one in your home more safely. And I think this is great business, right? I mean, it's the same reason why you could have all kinds of medical treatments, but we have a set of medical treatments that we have to go through a process before they're released to the public. Okay. And then we have even within those, we have ones that have known side effects, and humans have to decide, do I want that indigestion to be a few pounds lighter? Right. Okay. And people can make that. That's the whole point is there are some choices, many, many, many choices, the vast majority. This is what Buckley says, I will not cede my power. So many of these choices need to be back with the people. But that kind of assumes that the people are given the truthful information to make the choice. They're not being deceived. And assumes, hopefully, that most of the choices are net good for them versus most of them all being net bad for them to different degrees. And I think we just need to change that. So this is really about corporate stewardship and concentration of power. And I think the attempt to make it play by different rules as we started the conversation, the conservatives need to stand up, thwart history once again and say, no, you got to play by the rules. And you should build it in a way that actually is good for people because that's going to be good for the economy and good for the world. And if we do that to the logical extent, we will prevail because, Europe, South America, all these other countries that are having to figure out, are they better aligned with China? I mean, I never thought I'd even imagine this, but we have countries like Canada trying to figure out, are they better aligned with China than us? And we have got to turn this around. And if we want to do it with AI, I'm saying this is how we do it with AI.
So we're a little bit over our time here, so I'm going to wrap us up. But you've laid out, I think, a very innovative solution that, for my mind, as a Hayekian, Reaganite, conservative, that doesn't feel the need with the AI moment to abandon any of my principles. I think everything you're saying is consistent within my principles. We might turn some knobs on a few things here and there, but we're playing in the same sandbox. My question is, rubber to road, how does this happen legislatively? Is this a federal bill that needs to be proposed? How do we get something like this in place?
Yeah, so I think I touted her earlier. I think that Senator Blackburn has the closest framework federally to this in a proposal that she has right now. And I think it's called the Trump America Act, actually, about American machine intelligence. And it's actually put together in multiple areas. And so I think that there are areas we still need to deal with and wrestle with, like the unknown risks a little bit that have to be added into that. But I do believe that it ultimately is a federal standard. But I think that the effort to stop the states from being the laboratories of democracy, as Reagan and others supported, I think stopping them before we have a federal standard is a gross malpractice. It is a gross abuse. Because what you're saying is we're going to sacrifice the kids, we're going to sacrifice the elderly, we're going to sacrifice the creators until the federal government gets their act together. And in about 30 years, we've seen almost no laws regulating tech, and it's now the biggest lobby by far. So I don't know the federal government can actually get it done. I want to believe it can, but I think the states need to pick this up and run with it aggressively on these principles. So I think conservative states, whether it's Governor DeSantis or Governor Cox, or I could keep going with several others that are like in this, Governor Sanders, Huckabee Sanders and others, there are many that have been trying to protect, especially their kids, from these technology abuses. So I think the age verification area is an easy place. Age verification should be there for social. It should be there for AI. We should have a different set of protections for young people versus adults. Those are one standard. We have, image and likeness for individuals, like the Elvis Act in my home state, Tennessee. That's a great example of this. So I believe that there are proposals that are in motion, and the White House doesn't need to be, I say White House, certain parts of it. I don't actually believe the president or vice president are on board with what I'm about saying, but what's been happening, I don't think parts of the White House need to be calling up state legislators saying, don't pass regulations protecting your citizens because we want to have a better negotiating position. Because I don't want the Democrats to be the only ones protecting people. That would be terrible, terrible politics. This is an opportunity for us to have a consensus issue and bring the country back together on something. And the president and these states could be leading on this and also keeping us in a free market economy in the process.
Yeah. Well, tell me, is there a website? Is there a resource that we could direct listeners to around some of these issues, things that you're a part of? Other than me having you back on the podcast, how can listeners stay in touch with the fine thought and activity of Tim Estes?
Oh, well, I think the only thing you'll probably see me on is I'm on X, and I comment on these things some. And so, in the coming weeks or months, there might be more to talk about on that front.
Okay.
But yeah, this has been a, kind of a personal labor of love for some time. And I'm just blessed to get an opportunity to bring these ideas up and hopefully find people that want to, move us this direction. And in the process, I've got my 2 young kids, my 7 and 9-year-old boys, and I think there's, a chance to have a very different and better world versus a different and worse world for them.
Well, we'll put your Twitter handle in the show notes, and we'll have you back here on Capitol Record. It's a big and important subject. You have a lot of great insights, and I can promise you that listeners got a lot out of this today. I know I did. Thanks so much, Tim.
David, thanks for having me. Nice to see you.
And thank you for listening to another episode of David Bonson's Capitol Record. I hope you found that as provocative and informative and interesting as I did. A lot to think about, digest it a bit. We're going to come back to you. You already heard last week, my guest Renee Ananow brought up this notion that he believes a massive government bailout will happen for open AI in the future based on fiscal inevitability of their capital expenditures commitments being unsustainable and the government attempting to rationalize it on the basis of national security. Renee had his own concerns and criticisms there. You hear the different category of what Tim has brought up today. Either way, there's a lot for us to think about here. And there's very little that forces me to say, no, nothing to see here. I'm a free market guy. Let's let this roll. There's issues here that free market people like us need to think about. And the reason is because our purpose is to, yes, defend and uphold a free society, but to defend and uphold a free and virtuous society. And that when you lose one, you inevitably will lose the other. And we're not going to let that happen as we endeavor to promote the conditions for human flourishing. Thanks for listening to Capitol Record.